Installing Microsoft Cluster Server Cluster, Part 3 of 3. You can see the details of this at wanfuse.blogspot.com for a written document of everything we do here that goes into slightly more detail. As we were showing in the previous video, is installing the SQL cluster now. We're speeding this up so that it doesn't take so long to do, but it shall finish here in just a few minutes. Okay, we've created the cluster and we're going to view the report and see what errors it gives us, if any, and hopefully we don't see any errors here. As we go down to the bottom there, it says the cluster was successfully created, finishing cluster creation. So we're all set. The cluster was created. The last thing we're going to do is install the Distributed Transaction Coordinator service, which is not required, but is often used in conjunction with SQL Server. And we're configuring application, and next, and Distributed Transaction Coordinator is selected, and click on next. We're going to give this name of SQL Cluster DTC, which is the default, and it's going to be on the 10.10.10 network, and it's going to give the address of 54, which is the next one in series. I try to keep things straight in the DHCP ranges. Here we're selecting the cluster disk. There's one cluster disk required for this service alone. These cluster disks, which are done through ISCSI, as we showed earlier in the previous video, and I believe it was video 1, are only 10 gig a piece, which is more than sufficient for my needs here. And we're going to click on Finish. You could have clicked on View Report, but I know that it's running, so I didn't do that. As you can see, online is pending, and there it is. The MSCS SQL Cluster service is running. Now we can move on to installing SQL Server into the cluster. Okay. Alright. Now this brings us to a bug which is in Proxmox 2.0 because it is still in beta, which is very annoying. It does not acknowledge the change of the ISO files in the CD-ROM. So the workaround for that is to actually create a second VM, a fourth VM with just Windows 7 installed, and mounting the ISO. And you'll need a reboot, but just uninstalling the CD-ROM and reinstalling the CD-ROM with the right ISO in that virtual machine and accessing it over the network. It's a pain, but it's necessary. It does, because it doesn't acknowledge it. I've filed a bug report and waiting to hear back on that. There we are. We go to a share and we install it. It takes a little bit longer because it's going over the network to bring the files down, but it is a virtualized network, so it's not that bad. Again, here I'm describing the bug in version Proxmox 2.0 beta, which leaves you unable to swap CD-ROM images in CD-ROM. The workaround is sloppy. There's no question about it, but it does work, and it doesn't cause any downtime with the actual service by doing that. Again, here we're just describing that we're going to build the server with Windows 7 installed. It can be shut down and reboot freely. Mount the CD-ROM as a VMware share so you can access it through the VM that you're working on over the network. If you can't ping the servers, then you can't access the shares. So you got to make sure that the firewall is open enough to be able to do that. Here we're selecting the remote CD-ROM, and we're running setup. The SQL Server installation starts, and that's going to take a few moments. And we're going to go to planning and server configuration checker and run that configuration checker to make sure that it runs. As we can see here, we passed 15, failed 3 with warnings, warning 0. And we're actually going through and we're running that because those failures were not relevant. Sorry, there was 0 failures. Apologize. Okay, now we're selecting the Euler agreement, and the warning generated because of our SQL was due to the SQL implementation. That's why we ignored them. I did that off the camera as I investigated that, so that's why I blinked by those errors. It's safe to ignore for now. The implementation of ISCSI through KVM and Proxmox, ZFS, and ISCSI is the fixes in the works for that problem, and I thank Ross for again for working so hard on that for me. Okay, and here we're selecting the full installation of SQL Server, and we're installing all the components. You might not necessarily need them all. It depends on what you're doing. So you would select the ones that you wanted. Okay, the cluster name, the network name is SQL Cluster 2, and we're going to keep it the default MSCS Server for the named instance inside the database. And there it is. It's finished. This looks like it's got errors, but it actually doesn't. I was a little confused by that the first time I saw it. This does not mean errors because there's red there. It's fine. We did find a problem with the default instance name because we had already used it, so we changed that default instance names to MSCS Server 2, and went through next and ran it. Okay, here we're selecting the cluster disk number 2. You can see the first one's disappeared because that's being taken by the other service right now. And we're not doing DHCP, we're doing a static address. So we're going to type that in here, 10.10.20.55. Now, somewhere along the line here, we had errors related to the 10.10.20 network being selected. My recommendation is to try to create 11.10.10 network for, I'm sorry, 11.10.20 network for the cluster disks because of an interference between those two networks, which is a bug in Microsoft's software where it doesn't see those two as two separate subnets, even though they actually are. And I go into that a little bit more in my blog. Here I'm selecting the SQL Server account for the SQL servers, and I'm using all the same SQL admin account. To be more secure, you can select separate accounts. It's just a default user, and Microsoft SQL Server 2008 actually gives it the user the proper rights, and it's as it does the install. That is different in SQL Server 2003, which you have to manually configure the permissions. Here we're selecting the data directory and just looking this over here. We're going to keep it all as the default. And this file stream part of SQL Server for Transit SQL Access, I'm going to enable that. I think it's a good idea for later on when you're working with a SQL cluster. And we're using Windows Authentication mode, and we're entering the SQL Server admin user in both these screens that have just appeared. We go through this a little fast. I apologize. In the next video I'll try to slow those things down a little bit so they're easier to see. The data directory we're going to click on here, and we're going to actually do nothing. We're going to keep those as the same. In a real environment you might want to divide those up among different disks. Do not install but don't configure the report server. It is installing it, but it's not configuring it. Okay, 3 updates were not applicable: 2000 file stream hotfix check and A couple of others, they weren't relevant, so it just generated a warning there. That's okay. Now everything is selected and everything's ready to run, and with the installation of the SQL Server is going to go ahead and go forth. We're going to speed up the video here so that this takes less time and doesn't bore anybody, but it is going through and doing the installation there. Okay, the SQL Server cluster installation for the first node is installed. Next we have to configure the other two nodes of the cluster nodes, the other two cluster nodes. Okay, we're checking the rules as to the installation. We didn't show it, but we actually selected add node to a SQL Server failover cluster there, which is just above the dialog box that shows there. And we're going to accept the Euler agreement terms, and we're going to process the information. Now it finds the cluster, which is good. So it's expecting those nodes to be there. It's doing a rule check right now, and give that a few moments. The cluster verification warnings were generated again because of the bug with my storage implementation for ISCSI, which is being worked on now. Actually, other implementations of commercial products had the same bug, and they fixed them just a little bit sooner than the open source. Sometimes open source lags because it's done by people on their own time. And there we go. It passed everything and said a few of them were not applicable. And we're going to click OK and click Next, and it's a waiting game. So we're going to time warp here. Okay, the SQL Server node number 2 is installed. And now we're going to the node 3 and doing the remote setup of the from this remote CD-ROM. Again, that we use the work on for Proxmox bug there, and we run it. And this one will go just as fast. We click on installation on the page that appears and add node to SQL Server cluster, and we click on run. Okay, passed 7, failed 0, warning 0, and skipped 0. So that's good. Everything went smoothly. Now the actual installation, and we're going to accept the Euler agreement on this node and click install. Now we have custom entries to the firewall, which there are many. I've added them to a batch file. A few of them I found on the internet, but there was insufficient for the server, so I extended and added to that batch file and deleted a couple that were unnecessary. You can find that batch file at winfuse.blogspot.com/2012/01 how to install Microsoft MSCS SQL Server HTML and search for Netshell. As you can see there, I misspelled the Microsoft cluster there. Apologize for that. Here we go. There's the on a share. There's the SQL Firewall batch file, which I'm going to run, and then I'll show you the file, what's in it. As you can see here, there's a lot of Netshell commands. There's about 20 or 30 of them for opening different ports for the different services for SQL Server. They were all I could find that were relevant to it, so it is a fairly complete list. If anybody finds any others that are missing, please update my blog, make a note, and let me know. As you can see here, they're all Netshell commands and a pause command at the end. We still see the firewall warning when it's enabled, regardless of whether the firewall is enabled or not. I'm not sure why that is. The firewall warning comes up just to let you know, I guess, that potentially things won't work if you don't open the ports. But I'm pretty confident that I've opened most of the ports necessary for all the services for SQL. Again, let me know if I miss one. And we ran that Lastly, we're going to validate the cluster. I'm going to run the validation tool. This validation actually fails in a couple places. Here we're selecting to take the services offline. You wouldn't want to do that to a production system if it was already running stuff, but since this isn't running anything, it's taking those services offline, and it's going to run check disk and on the cluster disks, and it's going to go through and do that as it checks. I'm just mentioning here that I had VMBR0 with DHCP services at the beginning, which earlier on I should have noted that those static addresses had to be placed on the net cards for the LAN side, which I didn't show you. I did outside this video. I apologize for missing that step, but just a warning to let you know here. You should always use static addressing on clusters, because if the DHCP service fails, the whole cluster will go down. And so that you're having a single point of failure. So get some screenshots coming up on the network configs as they are, just to show you the LAN side of the network cards, and to show you how that the last octet is the same on the cluster network and on the LAN network. The last octet is the same, but it's actually on a different subnet. You can't use the same subnet on the same on two network cards unless you're bonding network cards, which we're not doing here. Okay, and we also append the DNS suffix, so we add that there. This is rudimentary networking stuff that somebody should have a good idea or handle on before they do this anyways. When I assign IP addresses to ClusterNet, I make sure that it is on a separate subnet, but I keep the last octet the same. I'm stressing that because it makes it a lot less confusing to remember what IP address is assigned to what server. 10.10.50 is for the LAN and the ClusterNet on SQL Server 4. 10.50 51 is on Cluster Server 5, and Cluster Server 6 is 52 is the last octet. Once during the making of this video, it complained the addresses were on the same subnet for both network adapters on each server. This is a definite bug, so I just letting you know that you should try to go back to the etc network configuration and select 10.11.10.20.x network with subnet mask 255.255.255.0, which seems to take care of the bug. That is a totally different subnet. On the first octet there is off by 1, so it won't get confused with that. It's just an update to let you know that there is a known issue with sometimes it seeing two subnets as the same, and I'm not sure why that is at this stage of the game, but we took care of that. We have to keep it consistent with etc network configuration. etc network interfaces in order to keep communication. But actually on the ClusterNet there is no need to communicate with the outside, so if it wasn't updated with the same subnet, it wouldn't affect anything. We show a couple warnings there. Thank you for watching this video. The installation did succeed, and as Pokey Pig would say, that's all folks. Thanks for watching. http://wanfuse.blogspot.com for more information and more detail on the installations, which I kind of hurried through a few of the spots during this video. Thank you and have a good day.